Welcome back to day 2 of Lessons Learned from the Pandemic, Redesigning Clinical Care, Research, and Public Health. I'm Dr. Daniel Koritskis from the Division of Infectious Diseases at Boston's Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And on behalf of my co-chairs, Professor Michel Kazatskine and Nicole Lurie, it's really a pleasure to welcome you back for the second half of our program. Today we have 2 sessions, which will be just as interesting as yesterday's sessions. Session 3 will be No One is Safe Until Everyone Is, and Session 4, Are We Ready for the Next Pandemic? Some practical tips as a reminder: please submit your questions through the live Q&A widget. We really welcome questions from our virtual audience, and we'll be sure to forward them to our speakers during our panel discussions that follow each session. In case you run into any trouble during the program, please click the live support icon for technical assistance. I'd also like to ask you again to please participate in the post-meeting survey once the workshop has concluded. A certificate of attendance will be sent by email upon completion of the post-meeting survey, and this survey is really essential for us to be able to improve on the program and to meet your future needs. It's now my pleasure to introduce Nicole Lurie from the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations in the United States, who will chair the first session.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. As you heard, this session is entitled No One is Safe Until Everyone Is, which was a bit of a motto of the pandemic response from WHO, but frankly, still very much remains the case. Our session today is going to feature 2 speakers. Dr. Scott Ratson is going to talk to us about trust and misinformation and vaccine acceptance. And then we will also pivot a little bit to talking about a set of issues in access to vaccines, with Ilse Terrell talking first about that. That will then be followed by a panel discussion, which I think is our typical format. So just a quick word about Scott, who's been a friend and colleague for a long time. He's really been a pioneer in the field of health literacy and in health communication and diplomacy. He's a distinguished lecturer at the University of New York and is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Health Communication, among his many other accolades. So let me turn first to Scott, and we will hear from him. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Nikki, for the introduction, and thank the chairs for selecting me and choosing this really important topic. The title today is Health Equity and Access to Medical Countermeasures. And I'm happy to go through, for about 20 minutes, many ideas to really address what was well-established challenge that we have of building trust. So right from the beginning, let me just say, I'd like to charge, sort of as St. Jerome thinking, the uncertain sciences. What do we need to do for clinical care, research, and public health with the areas that were just mentioned? Trust and confidence in science, vaccine hesitancy, and our health policy and governance. And it goes back to the idea of a Sisyphean challenge. And if you look at the old 5th century BC Greek jar that's at the British Museum, you see Sisyphus, who was a legendary king who was sentenced to immortality. And the legend goes that he was sentenced to push the rock up the hill, and it would never make it to the top and go down and go back over and over again. And I feel that's kind of where we are today. And I'm going to start with just what we knew and what we've been doing. The key to containing Ebola, I was on the CDC Board of Scientific Counselors for Office of Infectious Disease at the time, and we knew what to do with Ebola, and we talked about creating a single authoritative source. And I'm not saying that that was done correctly, but we knew that there was something that could be done, and we had the tools to do that. Now, if I fast forward to where we are in 2020, I'm on the board of the National Academy's Board of Global Health. And we were speaking about the challenges that we saw already with then SARS-CoV-2 in January of 2020. And a few of us quickly wrote, Larry Gostin, Ruth Parker, and others, the need to already create a coordinated, trusted source. We knew it was a threat to the credibility, and we knew what we needed to do. We actually had this paper out a week before it was even called a pandemic. And the reason why it says number 5, it was the top 5 paper at the academies for the year, but still to this date, we don't believe that this coordinated, trusted source exists. At the same time, I edit the Journal of Health Communication. Let me thank Dr. Loy for contributions and the background. I've been doing this since 1995, 27 years, the journal. We've had hundreds or thousands of different articles. We very quickly put together what to do, vaccine communication in a pandemic, vaccine literacy to reduce hesitancy, restore trust, and immunize communities. We put this out even before the vaccine was on the market. And while we had promising strategies, again, we knew that the rock was going to be very difficult to push up this hill. So we continued on with the scientific base, and we knew that we needed to really get a lot of people involved in terms of the intermediaries. And unfortunately, what we had happening was the beginning of not only threats from, you might know from my American accent, the President of the United States calling the news fake news, but we also had independent arbiters, and we also had politicians deciding what to do. So we didn't have health with the scientific base that we all thought we could do. And I know both yesterday's, the chairs were talking about the independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response. And we know from really what Helen Clark was quoted as saying and others, that our current institutions, public and private, failed to protect people from a devastating pandemic. And without change, these institutions will not prevent a future one. Now that was in 2021. For 2 years, we knew what to do, but the CDC also did not do a great job. And this is just the last quote from Steve Morrison and others at SACE, who put a whole expert panel together to give some ideas to build the CDC that the country needs. And still, again, this is early 2023, they said the CDC does not have the capacity or resources to communicate effectively. CDC struggles to convey the most essential evolving public health messages during a crisis to audiences and communities across the country. Now, I did grab data from some different sources for the title today. And one of the best sources was from NORC in Chicago, which had a recent study that was published, although it was fielded at the end of 22, on what the scientific community, how they were viewed in terms of confidence. And as you can see, there has been a drop over the last few years from 48% to 39% of people having a great deal of confidence in the scientific community. I think what's more troubling on this, although it's only 1 year on this trend data, is those who have hardly any, that were up to 13%. And we're starting to see a stronger base in a number of different surveys of people hardening on the opposite of science. The same question was asked about medicine. For the medical community, I'm going to name some institutions. As far as the people running these institutions are concerned, would you say that you have a great deal of confidence, only some, or hardly any? And as you can see also in this, the hardly any has peaked at 16%. And we also have a drop-off, although not as much in medicine as we have in science. Now, at the same time, Edelman does a trust barometer every year of looking at health authorities in business and see how people are in terms of the trustworthy sources. And let me say what was strong here is that the national health authorities continue to be more trustworthy, according to the Edelman Trust Barometer, than others in the national government. So the health authorities that are at the governmental level. What continues to show and has been consistent year on year is employers and the private sector continues to be a trusted source of information. And although many of us worry about the social media, it's not as much as a trusted source across all ages, but it does make a difference if we broke this down further. But in the interest of time, we won't go through this, other than to realize that our health authorities and employers also still have some good trust. Now, I know Nikki and others have been involved with the U.S. Institute of Medicine, now the National Academies. And what we've always said there is what health is what we do together as a society to ensure the conditions in which everyone can be healthy. And that's been the challenge of how we have been able or unable to address the COVID pandemic. And I think part of it was how the media has put the information out, particularly trying to put the challenge of vaccination and calling vaccine hesitancy a big problem. And it wasn't just this on CNN in 2020 mentioning vaccine hesitancy may present the next obstacle. I also was quoted as saying warp speed was a problem of building some trust in terms of science. And the BMJ reminded that it was WHO in 2019 who had vaccine hesitancy as a top 10 threat. And while later we'll define what vaccine hesitancy is, unfortunately, vaccine hesitancy took a life of its own, and it actually gave some ideology to people. And Tom Frieden, former CDC director, warned of this in the New York Times, that vaccine hesitancy was making a better story than just vaccination in general. So what ended up happening is you had the media, unfortunately, putting everything in a right or wrong or yes or no or not on some equal footing, rather than the preponderance of evidence that we've known for years that vaccinations work and have eradicated and eliminated diseases in our lifetimes. So what is vaccine hesitancy? The WHO SAGE Committee, which is a Strategic Advisory Group for Emergencies, defined it as the delay in acceptance of refusal of vaccination despite availability of vaccination services. And let me commend Heidi Larson, who really has been one of the leaders in this and looking at trust in vaccines. And when we wrote the article in 2011 in Lancet, I was really the last on the communication side. We were trying to get the world to talk about vaccine confidence rather than vaccine hesitancy. But unfortunately, as later seen, and Heidi wrote in the New England Journal last year, we've lost that battle, and vaccine hesitancy, unfortunately, has taken on an ideological mission of its own. There's a complex phenomenon behind it. There's more than 70 factors that influence it. There's a whole value of vaccines that are out there. But in looking at influenza vaccine, it's clear that people are breaking on, not only on health literacy and education lines, but also in the trust of science and governments and other misinformation. I worked with some colleagues to try to change the narrative on vaccine hesitancy in the United States, along with Eric Snyder at the Commonwealth Fund and some colleagues at Ascension Health. We looked at 140,000 people early in the pandemic in the U.S. that were wanting to get vaccinated, but were unable to get vaccinated. And the media was calling a number of these people vaccine hesitant. But we basically were saying, no, they were vaccine ready. So the blue were nearly 89% of the public were ready to get a vaccine. We just didn't have access. We just didn't have the ability to get them to either a clinic or to get the vaccines to wherever they might be. And I think the characterization that we're trying to move, and this was Heidi Larson's term that's bolded there, is that we can move people in their stage of readiness to vaccination. And I think just why it may be ominous of where we are with trust in science and medicine, we can move people back into the right direction with communication and with adequate systems and policies that I know we'll be talking about with our panel. This is the number that Tom Boyke at the Council of Foreign Relations has quoted in his article in The Lancet of 318,000 vaccine-preventable deaths in the United States due to the consequences of not only vaccine hesitancy, but people not getting vaccinated. Others put this number anywhere from 200,000 to 500,000. The bottom line is it's a significant number. And as you can see, the top 5 reasons, it's 42% don't trust vaccines, and 35% don't trust the government. So it's a lot about the trust in the intermediaries as well as the science that we need to overcome. And I've been fortunate to work with Jeff Lazarus. I know one of the other co-chairs of this, and thank Jeff for the opportunity to collaborate now. For 4 years, we fielded a study in 23 countries. This was the first year that we did in 2020. I'll just quickly note here that the vaccine hesitancy, it did in fact move, although we were calling it more vaccine confidence, that people were able to move up from 59% at one point, or it's 59% of the world's population, but it increased to 79% as we lump all of this together. What I think is most interesting, particularly with many French colleagues, not only here in the room and otherwise, is that France was looked at as a very vaccine hesitant or lack of confident country. And as you can see, they had a population that was in the 50s, but with adequate policies, there's a 38.7% increase over the 3 years in terms of policies and communication that move people to get vaccinated. There's another study that was just out or will be released. This is a preprint. This was presented yesterday in the Vaccine Congress in Glasgow. And I'm able to get 2 slides from, again, the Vaccine Confidence Project, Heidi Larson's work with colleagues, and the 122 countries, but these are highlighted, that vaccine confidence, now this is on all vaccines, not just COVID vaccines, unfortunately also have been going down, decreasing in 24 countries. And the confidence is only up in a few countries. As you can see, again, France has been quite successful in terms of vaccine safety. Similarly, the next slide is just on the importance of vaccines. I think what's more troubling here in looking at vaccines for children is that there's been a great drop-off, double-digit drop-off in over 46 countries. So our work is cut out for us in terms of addressing vaccine confidence and trust. Now, I know the organizers asked me not just to paint a bad picture or the picture of the world as it is, but maybe as the world as it can be. And that's kind of the idea. What is the evidence that we have? How can we address health equity, vaccine equity, and the challenges that we all face? This is just a mix that we know that the science was able to come up with a vaccine that worked. But the social sciences were sidelined. And if you look at the top right, Ashish Jha, who was leading the COVID task force most recently for the United States, said they didn't get the social science right. But even more importantly, Francis Collins, who ran the NIH director for a number of years, said the same thing. We need to get knowledge from credible sources. The articles on the left are just a number of people who've been writing about this for years. I was fortunate during my Harvard fellowship, I worked with Barry Bloom and Larry Gostin, and that article on the bottom on safe vaccinations for a healthy nation. And we wrote about law, science, and communication as the 3 elements that needed to work together. And unfortunately, that evidence base, we don't believe, has been followed at this time. And we also have, facts don't matter. And COVID, while we thought it would be more important to say we were able to overcome from a pandemic that we hadn't had for over 100 years, nonetheless, facts haven't mattered. And what's even worse and more troubling is the health communication science. There's a disinvestment. The 2 articles that are on the right in JAMA are talking about $153 million that was just pulled or not awarded or not even put out for researchers to bid on in terms of advancing health communication science due to many political reasons that the Dean Schillinger writes about in the article if you search it up. So what do? It's not an easy place that we're in. And I like to, in my field of health communication, I lead a program, Health Communication for Social Change. A lot of it is taking from other fields, whether it's political science or history, as in the case of Neil Ferguson, who wrote The Square and the Tower, who's based in the UK, and Anne-Marie Slaughter, who wrote The Chessboard and the Web, formerly dean at Princeton, Woodrow Wilson School of International Relations, now the New America Foundation, have both written about how we communicate in our world and Ferguson's work is more of, that's Siena. In the old days, the tower, it would, whatever the educated or elected folks would say, people would follow. And we had a traditional system, rewards and power, and a way that people would make decisions based upon logic, or even, shall we say, the old ancient canons of rhetoric of Cicero and Quintilian there in Italy. And then similarly, what happened now, though, is the chessboard and the web has the whole web, that we have a multinodal network, just like we have a multipolar decision-making process. And Anne-Marie writes that we really need to create these hubs and these networks and motivate people of where they're getting their information. It's easier said than done, and how we curate that is not so simple. Now, Jeff Lazarus led a Delphi consensus that was published in Nature earlier this year. 386 experts came together, which I know what many of you have been doing for years with WHO. We need a whole-of-society approach. But we also need a whole-of-society approach from multiple disciplines. And that's what I think was clearer in this group, of the need for business and civil society, engineering, faith-based communities, modeling, military, media, and psychology, all need to come together to figure out what we can do to end the next, or prepare, as this meeting is about, the next public health threat. Now, my last couple of slides are just some ideas that are a little bit further. If you wanted to look in the vaccine area, we published a paper called Multisectoral Actions to Build Trust at the Local and Community Level to Promote Vaccine Acceptance. This was an expert roundtable that was just published in Vaccine this summer. And similarly to what Jeff Lazarus and colleagues have come up with on the broad Delphi on the pandemic preparedness, we need the same thing even dealing with vaccination. Multisectoral responses, trusted local stakeholders and messengers, combating mis and disinformation, ensuring consistent recommendations and messaging. And the simple term that I like to use, it's not just the message, it's the dosage. We have to say it multiple times from multiple people, trustworthy sources, working with media, and then finally, local healthcare professionals, including community health workers, as key players in effective vaccine communication. I can't say how more important both civil society and community-based groups are in addressing health and preparing us for a better future. So the final slide is, again, Sisyphus. This goes back to Titian's work in the Prado, also pushing the rock up the hill. How do we do this? How do we rebuild trust and advance equity? We have new technologies. We are nowhere near as clever. I could have shown the whole infodemiology scatter graphs that show how the negative impact of misinformation is out there, drowning the positive impact of science and evidence-based information. We can communicate consistently and credibly. How do we do that? How can we do that with government and society and business and others? And I've been working with multisectoral responses with a business group, the U.S. Council for International Business, to try to get people to work together at multiple levels to build trust and the societal agenda. So how do we galvanize that? And we need that in all sorts of areas. And then finally, do we need a new initiative, but something that's reminding us on strengthening information on global health threats? I called it Insight in that article for the Council on Foreign Relations, Overcoming Cacophony in Public Health Communication After COVID. And let me say that article and others just reminds that we need a pandemic warning system or even an outbreak warning system, much like we have a weather system in place that people can understand with a health literate lens to it at all levels. And then this is my final slide. I believe we can build trust, we can build confidence, and we can address health equity, including access to medical countermeasures that I know Els will speak about. Camus wrote about Sisyphus years later, or centuries later. There's no longer a single idea explaining everything, but an infinite number of essences giving a meaning to an infinite number of objects. The world comes to a stop, but it also lights up. We came to a stop during this pandemic, and we have an opportunity for the world to light up. I'm really looking forward to the discussion with Dan and Michelle. Appreciate the opportunity today to share this with you, and looking forward to the question and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Scott. So many questions and so much fertile material for our discussion when we get to it. We are now going to hear from Els Terrell, who, as I think many of you know, ran the Access campaign at Médecins Sans Frontières for a long time, and is now a visiting fellow at the UCL Institute for Public Programs in the UK. And she's going to talk about vaccines free for all or sold at a premium. So thanks, Els.
Thank you so much, Nikki, for the kind introduction and for the organizers to inviting me here. And you gave me a quite provocative title, Vaccines Free to All or Sold at a Premium. And it gives me the opportunity to actually immediately debunk one of the myths that we often hear, that certain things could be for free. And actually, one of the points I want to make is that free for all doesn't exist. There is always someone who pays. And usually, actually, it's us, it's the people. Either we pay vaccines or medicines out of pocket individually or collectively via taxes that our government collects, and with that funds public health systems and sometimes also healthcare, sometimes also collectively in plus or minus inclusive ways via health insurance premiums, and often a combination of all those, because as you know, how we finance medicines and vaccines is very complicated often and different in different countries. But so the real question is, how do we as individuals and as a society pay for vaccines, and to whom do we pay, and what do we get for what we pay for? And turning the question a bit further, it becomes, what is the best way for a society to pay for the vaccines that we need and want for public health, so including the medical innovation to get there, and, very importantly, have them available when and where needed, equitably and affordably. And especially that latter aspect is not always taken into account. And so that brings me to why are we having this conversation? And I think you're all familiar with this graph that reflects the situation of access to COVID vaccines on the 1st of March 2022, so 14, 15 months after these vaccines became available, a major breakthrough. We've never had so rapidly new vaccines, but their availability and access was highly inequitable, a situation that Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, referred to as vaccine apartheid. Now, why did we end up in this situation? We heard a little bit yesterday about some of the geopolitics and the hoarding that Western countries did. We've just also heard about vaccine hesitancy. But the main issue that was at stake there was that actually the control, the ownership over these vaccines was in the hand of private companies. They were not driven by public health ownership. And as we will see, this is something that has a major impact on how indeed we get access to vaccines. And I want to come back to something like, why do we even have vaccines? What is the system through which we make and deliver vaccines? And so, is it really for public health, or have we kind of derailed into a for-profit system that has forgotten public health? And I want to remind everybody, despite some of the hesitancy that we heard, overall, vaccines and vaccination are amongst the most transformative inventions and interventions in public health that we have witnessed the past 100+ years. Another particular characteristic, because therefore, vaccines and pharmaceuticals in general, but vaccines are not just ordinary commodities, but they're also based on lengthy and costly research and development efforts. There is a lot of technology and knowledge involved. There is a lot of regulation because we want vaccines to be safe, effective, and of quality. There is also a lot of risk of failure in the development of vaccines. So it's not an ordinary commodity. But what we have done as a society, collectively, politically, is we have chosen today that we have a health innovation ecosystem, a business model where we have delegated the supply of pharmaceuticals, including these very important vaccines, largely to the private sector that, of course, functions within a market logic. And so it means that we believe that private investments and private sector entrepreneurialism is the main driving force to get us the vaccines, with, of course, and I'll come back to that, massive public policy support and funding support throughout the whole R&D value chain. But in essence, the initiative, the ownership, and the control sits with the private sector, and so also their priority setting. And priority setting, therefore, becomes based on market prospects rather than health needs. Because the primary objective, these private companies, and many are multinational behemoths, they are pursuing profits, growth in the market, shareholder return, investor return, etc. And a core policy tool to be able to do that are monopoly rights. Patents, trade secrets, market exclusivities on both the technologies, the knowledge, and the final products, which give an enormous pricing power and a control over who gets to have access to the vaccines, who to sell to, where to manufacture, etc. Now, I think it's important to remind ourselves it hasn't always been like that. Major medical breakthroughs in the early days of the early years of the 20th century, and I think, for instance, penicillin, insulin, but also the polio vaccine, were made with the idea of serving public health, and they were made widely available at a very low price and supported such that everybody could benefit. However, during the 1980s, and we certainly in the Western countries, we lived through a political climate where the idea was that the private sector could do things better. There was a lot of privatization also of public infrastructure, including, for instance, many countries had vaccine manufacturing capacity because vaccines were considered as so important for public health. But we've moved that all to the private sector on the idea that it is possible to create a win-win situation between the interests of pharmaceutical companies and the health needs. And so the assumption was that the private sector, given a number of incentives, and I don't have time to go into detail here, but there are a lot of public policy incentives, both financing for public research, for clinical trial infrastructure. We buy the medicines or the vaccines at the end of the day, again with public finance. There are public policies such as the intellectual property policies that are very generous to actually create a situation where private investors think it is worthwhile to actually invest in medical innovation and then be able to produce vaccines or pharmaceuticals. But so this assumption of win-win, that it was possible to do both, actually what we have learned is that the reality is that we have a growing misalignment between what drives pharmaceutical companies, especially with the recent financialization that really focuses a lot on maximizing profits, maximizing shareholder value, maximizing these revenues via sales, a lot of sales, high prices, and also minimizing risk for failure. And what we actually need for public health is actually developing medicines that address public health needs, but it doesn't fit with the prerogatives and the imperatives under which the pharmaceutical companies are today. The same, we need therapeutic advances, not more of the same, as many of the drugs and new therapeutics that come to market actually offer very little therapeutic advances. And last but not least, we want them to be widely available, accessibly, affordably, which all completely contrasts with the imperatives of the current financialized industry. And so what we have today is actually a multiplication of market failures that also, and I think someone said yesterday, Agnes, that basically if there are market failures, it is public investment and policy that is there to correct, but we are not having these corrections. We have public health failures as well, because if you look at, and on the left you can see a graph on looking at all the new medicines that have come to market, you see that more than half of them do not represent any added therapeutic value. So there is a lot of wastage in the system to get a few important medical breakthroughs, but many get to market, and apparently the business model allows that and makes it profitable. At the same time, we have many medicines that are missing. Everybody knows about the threat of antimicrobial resistance, antibiotic resistance, I'm sorry. We don't have a robust pipeline of new antibiotics. And even old medicines are increasingly in stockouts, ruptures, because it's not profitable enough to keep them on the market. And the few breakthroughs that we have, and I don't want to deny that there has been major advances, are often too expensive for health systems to actually be able to afford them, even increasingly in wealthy countries. So this is the market failure in general that we have with this system. Now, if we think about epidemics and pandemics, what we've learned from Ebola, from COVID, and other epidemics is that the market particularly doesn't work for outbreak diseases because there are particular characteristics of epidemics. For instance, they are unpredictable. We don't know when, where, what will be the next outbreak. So as a market, I mean, you don't know what it might be, so of course the market doesn't work. Often, and well, COVID was an exception, most outbreaks are small, localized, and represent an insignificant market to be attractive for pharmaceutical companies. Another practical difficulty is that clinical trials are an integral part of the outbreak response, which is a really complicated element. And I was part of Doctors Without Borders when we participated to a clinical trial for Ebola therapeutics in DR Congo. And I can tell you that combining like being in an emergency of Ebola and trying to do a quality clinical trial to establish the efficacy of novel interventions, it is very challenging. And so for pharmaceutical companies, those are all major disincentives. And so all of that to say that the dynamics that we have in the market play against equitable access. And so let's talk a little bit about the vaccine market, because that one too is very curious. So if you see, these are data from WHO Global Market Vaccine or Vaccine Market Reports 2022, I think. So looking at the top 10 manufacturers by value, you can see that 4 major pharmaceutical companies capture 73% of the total market by value. However, they only represent 24% by volume. And in fact, the single biggest producer of vaccines by volume is the Indian Serum Institute, but they only represent 2% of the value. And so you have this total imbalance, segmented market, where we have, over the past couple of years, a lot of effort to build a market for developing country vaccine manufacturers, DCVM, that through some market push and pull mechanism, primarily driven by donors, by Gavi, by UNICEF, are focusing on economies of scale, getting the lowest cost and price as a cost-plus production, but representing no real added value financially. And so what you have is actually 2 different value propositions in the vaccine market. At one hand, you have a high-income country vaccine market where you have generous government intervention to create and maintain this very profitable business case for private companies. And we all know that the pharmaceutical industry is amongst the most prosperous and profitable industrial sectors, in part because there is also support of long-term investments in research, development, also domestic production with subsidies, grants, assets, generous IP and regulatory incentives, and the willingness to pay premium prices, and public health vaccination programs that are willing to pay for that. So this is a very easy, profitable business model. And if we think about health security, you have instances like the US BARDA. Other countries are now, after COVID, setting up similar mechanisms which actually offer additional, what we call market push and pull mechanisms to incite private companies to work in those areas of health security. On the other side, we have a low and middle income country market that is primarily donor driven, and donors want to have, as they say, I think in the United States, the best bang for their buck. And so it's really driven to economies of scale, large producers, really cutthroat competition. And so with nothing to create actually a viable ecosystem, as we have done in wealthy countries. And so it assumes also that the overall and mainly high-income country market operates fine as is. It delivers health innovation that then where the equity can be solved by post hoc through charity, through donor-driven markets, etc. Ensure that also poor countries can have a part of the market and have really this market segmentation is built into the way we've conceived this market. But what we then do not do is address the structural inequities and dependencies, and it's all came back in our face, obviously, during COVID. And I think Agnes said that yesterday as well. There was not a problem of money during COVID. It was actually access to the technology and the knowledge, and where indeed the intellectual property rights that pharmaceutical companies hold as if it's their private property is indeed their sacred cow, and we're not willing, even in the biggest health crisis of our lifetime, to share it such that other countries could produce and have these technologies. And so this brings us to the work that I've been engaged in, including with members of the independent panel that have been mentioned several times, and some of them are here as well. Actually trying to say, well, if we want health equity, we really need transformational change. We can't keep on tinkering in the market and in the margins and fixing little market failures here and there. We need to really shape a global health industrial ecosystem for the common good, not for building GDP, but actually for driving health. And actually in the WHO market report that I showed earlier, the data of they come to a similar conclusion. They say we need to strike a much better balance between serving national interests, global public health objectives, and commercial incentives. And this can only be achieved through high-level diplomacy between countries and a commitment to a new paradigm. And this is where we have the opportunity today with the high-level conversations that are ongoing, including at the World Health Organization, World Health Assembly, for a new pandemic accord, where there is a real opportunity to try to come up with something different, because more of the same is not going to get us anywhere. And so we've been working with a number of members of the panel, but also broadening and bringing in also scientists and developers from the Global South, people who really want and are, by the way, already developing and manufacturing, but they feel that they don't have the space and the means to be an equitable partner in this endeavor. And so this is our latest paper that came out just a few weeks ago, where we really try to articulate how such a new value proposition can look like, how to move from the private incentives to a real public health-driven R&D ecosystem, end-to-end, from the science to access, where everything is really included and where you have this equity through every step. And one of the key elements, and I invite you all to read the paper, it's very rich. We did a lot of work on that, and really also with partners from Thailand, from Senegal, from Colombia, from India, to see like, what do people need in the global south? Because the problem is not in the global north, right? And I'm sorry to use these terms. I know that they're not ideal, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say. And so one of the proposals is really, can we set up regional R&D hubs led by local regional scientists, developers that can actually rapidly adapt these existing technology platforms that we are using for vaccines to newly emerging threats. And we call that last mile innovation because, as you will remember, the fact that we had vaccines for COVID in less than a year was because there are a handful of established vaccine platforms, and scientists adapt them to the new pathogen at threat, whether it's inactivated viruses, whether it's adenoviral vectors, even mRNA technology. It's the first time that we had vaccines, but the technology was already there. And what the scientists did is just switch what they were doing for developing or finalizing the development for COVID. So if we establish that capacity to do that last mile switching in the Global South, in a number of R&D hubs, and give the resilience and the trust also that they can develop their own vaccines and manufacture them, which of course means that we need to equip those hubs with the means to drive such innovation to address their priority health needs. And that means access to technology and know-how, including the freedom to operate and not be blocked by intellectual property rights held in the global north or elsewhere. It needs skilled human resources, of course, and access to appropriate capital. Capital financing that supports the public health mission, not capital that needs to maximize return, financial return on investment. And of course, linking that to independent clinical trial networks that can do the trials that we need to address the public health questions that we need, because that too has not always been the case. And the local manufacturing capacity. Everybody talks today about local manufacturing capacity, but without the link to the ownership or the control over the technologies and the R&D pipeline, we're going to just have the same inequities again and again. And so all of that together must be governed for public health purpose, and therefore it requires a totally new value proposition and economic proposition. And luckily we can count and we can rely on work that has been done notably, or for instance, but also notably by the WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All, chaired by Mariana Mazzucato, where a group of economists and health experts came together for 2 years and said, well, if the goal of our economic or our society is health for all, how can we rethink the economic rules, whether it's financing, intellectual property rights, capacity, trade, anything? How can we redefine the rules of the economic interplay such that the result is health for all? And specifically, there is the final report, and you have the link there on the screen. Final report covers the summary of 2 years of work, but there is also one brief specifically on governing health innovation for the common good, with a lot of very concrete ideas. And to say that it's also not an abstract idea. There is a very interesting project ongoing, and maybe before I go there, some countries are doing that. I mean, Brazil, for instance, has a health industrial ecosystem. And so I think that they are much more advanced in that thinking, that they mobilize their industrial capacity and their science capacity for public health. So it's not as if this is something new, but there is also a very interesting new initiative, which is the mRNA Technology Transfer Hub program initiated by the World Health Organization together with the Medicines Patent Pool, where actually a group of researchers and developers in South Africa are reproducing the basically a variant of the Moderna mRNA COVID vaccine to master that technology and be able then to share it with 15 or plus developers, manufacturers, public and private, in 15 middle-income countries, with the idea that they, not for COVID specifically, but will have that technology to actually next time be better able to address any health needs or use it for the health needs that they have today. And there is a report upcoming from the WHO Economics Council also articulating this project in terms of how can we govern that for the common good as an example of these regional R&D hubs that we have been proposing. So in conclusion, to finish, I think it's really important to ask the right questions and to use the right narrative. And so this whole issue is not a question of price or even cost, but about financing for health, not financing of health, but really for, and take that whole of government approach that others have already been mentioned. It's also not a question of public versus private. We need to set up ways in which we can productively govern the collaboration between public and private partners, but with the goal of public health, not, I mean, and unambiguously, not trying to create a win-win because we've failed in the past, and also not socializing the cost and privatizing the gains, as is often the case with public-private partnerships. And then, of course, the key there is, again, can we define the purpose and then design that end-to-end approach, whole of government, and build a value proposition that actually makes it clear how these public and private partners can work together, how they can be financed, governed, including the important issue of ownership and control over the knowledge and over the products, but to achieve the health goals. And one element there that I think becomes more and more critical is to kind of step back and say, look, critical health technologies and the underlying knowledge should be considered global commons, not privately held commodities. And so I want to add a sixth element to the list of global commons that Agnès yesterday laid out. And then we need to think about how are we going to govern that collective knowledge. And I was yesterday in the plane with someone who worked in a totally different field, and he used the term custodianship. And I quite like that term. Like, how do we collectively have the custodianship? Because knowledge, I mean, knowledge is of everybody, right? And do that in the public interest with open science, sharing, collaborating, rather than the proprietary competition in which we are in some kind of a rabbit hole. And with that, I thank you for your attention and happy to have questions.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And what a really thought-provoking presentation and conversation that was. We're going to move in a moment to a little bit of an open panel discussion. While we're sort of waiting for that to get ready, I might just note a couple things from my own personal perspective. As I think you know, I work at CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and CEPI was really set up just after the 2014-15 Ebola outbreak to think about how is it that you make vaccines for diseases and vaccines for which there is no market, and then how do you set up their development so that they would be equitably available to the world and those people who need them most. CEPRI was pretty young when COVID started, but we really embarked on a series of development projects very much aiming to go as far as we could to promote equitable access, even in the development. And, you know, that led to a series of successes and I think an important series of challenges that are important for us to note. At the same time, I'll just say I came from the US government. And I was very taken by the fact that in the US government, you know, whether we like it or not, it's all taxpayer funded, as is all of this work, whether it's ultimately donor funding in Gavi or UNICEF or country governments or taxpayers funding this. But in the US, you know, the system is set up. So there's, you know, entities responsible for public health and identifying that public health priority needs, for doing the research, for doing the advanced development, for guaranteeing a market for vaccines for which there is no market through BARDA and a strategic national stockpile, for buying the vaccines, and then for distributing them. The global system isn't set up this way at all. It's not terribly clear whose responsibility it is to make and finance these vaccines, although CEPI has stepped into this space. Coming into COVID, it wasn't remotely clear whose responsibility it was to guarantee a market for them. That's still not clear. Whose responsibility is it to buy them? By the time we all started figuring out who was going to be a procurer on behalf of low and middle income countries, all the high income countries, as we know, had ordered, you know, far too much vaccine that they needed. Who's responsible for the manufacturer? Who's going to pay for that? We know that there are a bunch of pieces of the system where the roles and responsibilities just aren't all that clear. And as Elle said, I mean, the system redesign and opportunities there are important. So we're going to move onto our panel and our panel discussion now. Unfortunately, we are missing Emma Wheatley. So I'm going to introduce and then start with Olive Shisana, and then I think we will move on to our much more open conversation. And there are some really important links to explore between Scott's presentation and Elsa's presentation, which I'm hoping that we can do through your questions and through the discussion. But for right now, let's move to Dr. Shisana, who is a social policy special advisor to President Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa, and is frankly just a force in global health. She chairs the Ministerial Advisory on National Health Insurance. She's played a pivotal role in legislation and health system improvement in her country, but her leadership also extends globally, co-chairing ACT-A and co-chairing the Johannesburg process to figure out what happens next after ACT-A, and she's chairman and CEO of Evidence-Based Solutions. So welcome, Dr. Shisana.
Thank you very much. Perhaps let me just have my slides on the screen. First, I want to thank you very much for inviting me to come in and engage in this particular discussions. So I really enjoyed the presentation by Scott, as well as the presentation by Esterel, which truly, as you say, they were very much, forcing us to think, a whole lot more. I'm hoping my slides will be on the screen, but if they are not, let me go ahead and just have a conversation because 10 minutes is very short. I've had the conversation with regard to whether, vaccines should be a public good or whether it should actually be a commodity that is being traded. And I want to address that issue. I personally believe that the state itself has to set up vaccine manufacturing companies, state companies that are responsible for production of vaccines. And I say so because as long as there is a profit motive, there's never going to be equity. There's always going to be a rush to make profit, to sell it on the stock market and be able to bring back profits to the shareholders. So that in itself is a big challenge. South Africa, before 1994, used to produce vaccines, particularly those that were necessary for childhood immunizations. And it was not that expensive. But then they decided, well, let's get rid of this and get the private sector to actually do this. That has not helped as much as we would have wanted to. But the slides I can't see because they are very small there on the screen, but let me perhaps take mine and use mine if that is going to help. So my concern that I had basically is that in talking about health equity and access to medical countermeasures, we have to look at, are there reviews that have been done that have really looked at, are there any lessons that were learned? First of all, there was a lesson, a report that we had commissioned with Norway as co-chairs of ACT-A. And in that evaluation, we were able to assess whether ACT-A was successful or not successful. Secondly, there's another report that has come in, which was the pandemic preparedness report on COVID-19, Make It Last Pandemic. Thirdly, there was also an access to medicine index in 2022, which has also done quite a bit of review. Let me just say what it is that they found. The IPPR report really found that the world was very much unprepared for COVID-19, that even though there was information that was given by WHO that there is a danger that is coming, there's a threat that's coming, unfortunately, the world did not take it serious, even though evidence was there that people are beginning to die. So there was not urgent action that was taken. And I think that's part and parcel of what Scott was saying, that the trust and misinformation and so forth. And people did not really understand the gravity of the situation until it really hit them. the low and middle income countries were also very vulnerable, and they were left behind. And when I say they were left behind, if you think about it, that about several countries, and I'm talking here of the developed countries, they had 200% cover of their population with regard to vaccines. And that is, I'm talking about Australia, Canada, New Zealand, UK, EU, as well as the United States. At the time when the African countries were not even able to get access to vaccines, even though the resources, they had money to be able to buy. The self-paying countries were not able to get vaccines even when they wanted it. I mean, I hear Estrel when she says that, let's look at it from the point of view that the vaccine manufacturers were controlling the access. But in reality, many of these, 80% of the countries that had vaccines were actually put in an export ban. So it wasn't just the private sector, but it was also the countries themselves. They were saying, no, you are not going to get it until my people have got it. Even though before the vaccine were developed, everyone was agreeing that we have to wait, and once we get them, we all are going to have equity. Everyone should not be left behind. But in reality, once the vaccines were there, they just ran away and said, we're taking care of our people and not your people. The ACTA independent evaluation has also done quite a lot of work, and the evaluation reports show that there was enough of this unequitable distribution, and that when it came to the pillars of the medical countermeasures, they were more interested in the question of vaccines. More work was being done on vaccines, very little on diagnostics. Nobody cared about whether people can be diagnosed or not, because of the resources were really spent very much on vaccines. In fact, much of the money that we raised actually went to vaccines and very little on diagnostics and very, very little on therapeutics. We're not really spending a lot of time developing treatments to make sure that people were to be taken care of once they are sick. And then you're looking at the Access to Medicines Index report, and they noticed obviously that R&D was concentrated very much in high-income countries. And it also looked at those infectious diseases that were common, but those that are emerging, there was very little research that was actually going on. The other thing is that in the preparation of commodities, medical commodities for sexual and reproductive health, at the time they declined significantly during that particular period. On the next slide, on market dynamics that affected access to low and middle income countries, I want to talk about four things. COVID products were not handled as a global public good, which I've really touched on earlier on, saying that the question of IP was going to the beneficiary companies. There was no way of being able to ensure that the IP is shared because it was co-developed with regard to those people that were participating in clinical trials. They contributed to the knowledge generation. In addition to that, they contributed as taxpayers. For example, in the United States, if you look at some of the medicines that were produced, they were actually produced with funds that came in from the state through financing universities, and those universities helped to develop the products. And once they were developed, the pharmaceutical companies took it, and the profits went to who? A few people. So there is a big problem there. I talked earlier about the hoarding of products in low political will for solidarity. The countries provided clinical training platforms, but they didn't benefit. Contracted companies in middle income countries were forced to export, the product. For example, in South Africa, J&J had decided that Aspen, which was producing the J&J vaccines for COVID, should be sent to Europe before it could actually be sent. They flew it across the entire continent to Europe to take care of Europeans as opposed to Africans, where it was actually produced. This kind of inequities are totally unacceptable. And I hope that, there are lessons learned here that we should not be repeating in the future. And the other thing that was a big problem was the onerous conditions which were precedent imposed on self-financing countries. Some of the agreements that were made were very, very onerous. They required compulsory state-funded no-fault compensation schemes. They required you to pay higher premiums in advance and without any guarantee that funds are going to be reimbursed in case you don't need it anymore. And Africans were found to be at the back of the queue, mainly because they said, well, you don't have enough numbers, so let's just go to where other people have got more cases. And then the delivery was not guaranteed. And some of the times we waited for vaccines to arrive, they did not come in on time, but the companies were indemnified because of the kind of agreements that they've had. And I talked earlier about the export bans that have existed. The other thing I just want to mention is the question of the prolonged TRIPS waiver process. South Africa and India had proposed that there should be a TRIPS waiver so that we can treat the vaccines as a public good during that particular time. And they dragged it on. They discussed and discussed to death until the quadrilateral couldn't come to an agreement, which was India, South Africa, United States, and the EU. They couldn't come to any agreement whatsoever. Coming to the slide on key actions based on lessons learned on the clinical care, I think we need to make sure that the health system is ready to be able to deal with the pandemic. At ACA, we didn't do very well with regard to the question of health systems connector. It didn't really take off as much as the vaccine pillar took off. We need to make sure that we've got health workforce and we retain them and continue to have ongoing training, because we lost a whole lot of health workers during the pandemic. They did a great job, but those that remained, worked very, very hard, but there are too many that we lost. We must make sure that we bolster epidemiological support. We need to support the Africa CDC. They are trying to train 25,000 field epidemiologists so that they can be able to do surveillance and assist in the management of the pandemic. And of course, we have also to take into account the work that we're doing on the medical countermeasure platform to really look at the question of equity in access to medical countermeasures. And we do that through the Johannesburg process. Some of the key actions that we need to take, it's really in research and manufacturing.
I wonder, just a sec, I know we're getting a little short on time for discussion, so I wonder if I might ask you if you could wrap up. I know the slides started a little late, but yeah.
Oh, okay. No, I just want to say that let us make sure that in terms of IP, let us make sure that there is a collaboration in developing the IP itself in terms of academic institutions, and work together, all of us, whether within the high-income countries or low-income countries, and let's incentivize the tech transfer. Of course, a lot has been said with regard to the mRNA hub. I won't say much more about that. And of course, I talked about the issue of TRIPS. Finally, I want to say that some of the lessons that we need to learn with regard to public health, let us support the process that's going on the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body, as well as the Working Group on International Health Regulations. Let's make sure that we have regional structures that we should work with. Africa is coming up with a pandemic preparedness response authority, which is really going to be a treaty that would help us to decide how to handle the pandemic. And I want to end up by saying that let us strengthen our national public health institutions and academic networks, because that is going to be what we need when the new pandemic comes. Thank you very much. Sorry for being longer than I should have been.
That's okay. Your comments were terrific. And again, like the others, just really incredible food for thought. So we have some time now for open discussions and for questions. And I might just start us off and pick up from one of the questions that also came in the chat. If I think about Scott's presentation, and I think about the other two that follow, one of the many challenges that we have, I think, and so much of this all comes back to money, is that the more mis and disinformation we have, the smaller the quote unquote market for vaccines gets. the more hesitant people are to get into this space, etc. The misinformation about vaccines is part of a much broader misinformation pandemic in general. And as Peter Hotez just outlined in his new book, and as I think we all have really come to appreciate through the pandemic, it is, number one, pretty heavily subsidized, often by some state actors, but often it is really monetized. And so the people who promote a lot of this misinformation are actually making a ton of money off of the promotion of this misinformation. So this is a pretty perverse way the market's working. So I wonder, Scott, if you might answer one of the questions in the chat about, so what suggestions do you have for dealing with this misinformation pandemic overall? And then maybe ask Els and Olive if they might sort of link this set of comments to how this influences our ability to go forward with a science, with countermeasure, a vaccine, or other public health measure development, et cetera. So why don't we start there?
Sure. And thanks, Nikki. It was great to hear the challenges of Els and Olive also, mentioning where we do have, as you well presented, mis and disinformation fundamentally challenging our progress in science and medicine and public health. We're very concerned about it. And along with Peter Hotez and others, we've been discussing really at length what are the ways that we can engage, not just from the state side, because it needs this multi-sector approach. It cannot just be done through a state or regulatory process, and nor can it only be done from a voluntary process as well. So how do we get parties together to realize the importance of what we're calling advancing quality health information and communication? So it's information that will help people make appropriate decisions at all levels, from patients, citizens, the learned intermediaries through the sort of FDA side of it, but also the intermediaries that are taking charge of our investments. And also then how do we create a communication level also outlined in Peter's book, on a competency amongst all the institutions that we have that deliver health, whether it's medical institutions, public health institutions, schools, all the way down to local entities who decide if kids should be vaccinated to go to school, or how to invest in the appropriate infrastructure that's necessary for health. So the short is, there's no easy answer. We believe, much like this independent commission's going forward so we don't have another pandemic, is there something similarly that we need to do? And we're very seriously hoping to create a commission along with Larry Gostin and Georgetown and others, because we also need some legal levers, and we also need to communicate and maybe have some guidance that could be done at both national, supranational, regional levels, and build what's going back to the data that's there, the best trustworthy sources. Those are physicians. Those are scientists that are working in academic institutions, not necessarily scientists for the government. So we have to figure how we can strengthen all of those resources. And I do think it's possible, but also, if I can say, Nikki, at the end, as you know, it is a Sisyphean task, and we need all hands on.
Yeah. Gotcha. No, thank you. And one question I think we all have is, how do we learn from the past so that we don't keep going through this? But before I turn to Olive and Els, Paco in the chat wrote, I'm mostly interested in African countries. How can African countries overcome the vaccine hesitancy so that pandemics don't have the fatal outcomes they have? I think some of the answer to that is probably in some of the comments that Olive and Els made, but I would love to hear them weave their answer to that question into their comments. So I know we've only got like 12 minutes left or something. So maybe briefly from Els and then Olive.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nikki, and the people asking the questions. Again, just a few elements, because as I think Scott made very clear, it's a very complex issue. But in my in engagement, especially the last few years, also with scientists and developers in countries that have been left out of the picture that I presented earlier, there is a real desire to be participants in the process of the whole value chain from discovery to production of vaccines and countermeasures. And I mean, maybe diagnostics are more easy than vaccines at some point. And I think that there is also a willingness to really start with the community and engage communities such that countermeasures do not come falling out of the sky. And I mean, let's be honest, the pharmaceutical industry as a whole has not always had a good reputation in many countries. There are many issues that people don't trust, because we all know that profit goes before health, and that has a number of consequences. One big financer in global health, the Gates Foundation, also is a controversial actor. And I think we need to maybe step back a little bit from that idea that the one-size-fits-all, especially solutions coming from the north and being dumped on the south. And sorry to be a bit, pathetic about it, but I think there is a lot of possibility to locally engage, regionally engage, and maybe within the communities, it can build trust such that actually, when you start thinking about doing clinical trials, and Nikki, I think, and we both have been working a little bit on Lassa fever in West Africa. I mean, there is so much work to be done to actually, before we can even think about doing clinical trials there, with the community such that they actually feel part of the process that will ultimately deliver the medicines or vaccines they need. But then we need to make sure that we come right on our promises, and not, as Olive very clearly showed, and I mean, South Africa is a very flagrant example. They contribute to the research, to the clinical trials, and they have no access. That, of course, undermines any trust.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And there's a whole lot of questions wrapped up in that about where the roles and responsibilities are. They're probably not necessarily in supranational organizations to solve country problems, but I'm curious about the perspectives there too. Over to you, Olive.
Okay, I think what we need to do is really to invest in communication. Communication is a science, and we're not investing a lot in terms of communication. We just say, well, someone is a minister, they can be able to talk and convince people, or someone is a program manager, they can be able to communicate. I think we need to go, look at our budget and invest in communication and make sure we've got the right people that are communicating. But I think most importantly, we need to have community health workers on the ground. Esther is correct that you actually need to have the community health workers on the ground. We had a very good example of Africa CDC that noticed that there was a very low uptake, very low demand of vaccines. So what they did, they decided to train community health workers and go to communities. And as soon as they went into many of those communities, they started seeing an increase in uptake insofar as vaccines. So we cannot really leave it up to the educated to be the one that are telling people about vaccines are not good, and so forth, and misleading even those the less educated. What we need to do is make sure that we are on the ground, talking to people, explaining to people. I'm sure if we did that, we'll be able to succeed.
No, thanks. And this issue about the we being on the ground, I think, is just really an important one, and gets back to your very important comments about health system strengthening. Community health workers are an essential part of health systems and health system function day to day, not just in a crisis. And they are trusted parties and trusted messengers. And to think about how we incorporate them into all of our systems, about thinking about not only their day-to-day work, but the outbreak preparedness, outbreak response, vaccine education, all of those things feels to me like a terribly important thing. At the same time, and this is again maybe a question more for you and Scott, they're the people in communities most likely to have more efficient connections to the internet. They might more likely, because of their work, have cell phones, have connections, then start getting bombarded through social media with all kinds of misinformation and infodemic information. Where do you see as the levers as a country thinks about investing in communication, or some of the other larger organizations, Gabby, UNICEF, Africa, CDC, others think about investing in communication? Where do you see as the levers to positively impact the trajectory of where we need to go?
Well, I'm smiling, Nikki, because we worked on health literacy domestically in the U.S. I worked when I was at USAID in 2000 2002. We were developing a big health communication effort. Much of the work that was done and was funded by the U.S., but there needs to be more of not just north-south, but we really were trying to develop more south-south from an equity lens, and the health equity community I think is a way that we need to look at this together. So you are right on the community health workers. I want to thank Olive for saying invest in communication, and I believe that was not only the work that I know she's done in the past at WHO, but now in South Africa. I can't say that enough, and we're trying actually with the WHO. We're developing a course, just an online course that communities can use to build resources. It's for social media interventions, not to define and what is the infodemic, but what to do about it. And I think that's the part, and just on a domestic front, we have a health equity community collaborative with Health Leads, which is a US organization. We have 9,000 community members already on board for different levers of this. So stay tuned. I'd love to share more. I'd also figure out ways that we could do that, all of this work globally.
Super. Yep. So I'm mindful of the fact we have 5 minutes left. I wanted Olive to answer this question. Then I'm going to turn, just briefly, then I'm going to turn to each of you and just ask for sort of a 1 minute. What do you want the audience to take home from your message and from this conversation? Olive, over to you.
Okay. What I wanted to say with regard to what we can do, we can also use the law in dealing with this question of misinformation. During the disaster management period in South Africa, one of the regulations that we put in place was that you shall not be caught, communicating incorrect information, purposefully incorrect information. And that helped a little bit because people were now cautious, about miscommunicating. They had to go back and look at the information they were sending. Is it correct or is it not correct? So I think we can also use the law to be able to correct these things. In terms of my last words that I would like people to take home, I think we need to have a medical countermeasures platform that is going to coordinate all networks that are part and parcel of our ammunition to deal with a pandemic. We need to prepare for it. We need to make sure it's financed. We need to make sure we've got people that are highly trained to be able to coordinate all of these activities so that we must never be found wanting when a pandemic or an epidemic of pandemic potential suddenly descends on us. We really need to make sure we are ready. Let's not wait until it happens and then we start going around and say, what do we need to do? Who should do what? That should be defined in advance. Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's terrific. Els, let's go next to you.
It's a very difficult question, of course, because these issues are very big. But if there's one thing that I would like to say here is that, change is possible, and it's people that create change. However, we've talked a lot, and again, I refer to the talk of Agnes yesterday about, this is about power and power dynamics. And we have to accept and acknowledge that power is never given away without being forced to be taken away. Those who have power will keep it unless it's being taken from them. And so it's government's responsibility to reduce the enormous power that private companies today have over the knowledge, the technologies that we need, the world needs for public health. And so I think we cannot just all sit at the table and say, well, let's discuss again and again. We need to challenge the power dynamics. But it's possible, but we need to acknowledge that it's not going to happen just by sitting around a table and talk.
Thank you. Scott?
And I'll take the 1 minute and also take from Elle's presentation the idea of health diplomacy or global health diplomacy, but not solely based on state actors. We don't just need the governments there. Non-state actors include the pharmaceutical industry, include civil society, include academia, and to come up with some of the solutions. I think Olive's point on law is really important. We could look Keith Martin, who leads the Consortium of Universities of Global Health. He's Canadian, says, why can't we take the Canadian laws that protect, punish for hate speech on medicine and science? Why can't we bridge that to the South, not only the South in North America, but broadly? What about the hate speech that we have here in Europe and other ways that we can look at addressing misinformation? So there's laws, there's policies, and then thirdly, the investment in communication. And that investment in communication needs to, I think, as both have said, we need to have the dialogue in a diplomatic way to come up with the solutions where people are owners that eventually will change the power dynamic. We're all in this together, and health is our only common currency. So I mean, the meeting, again, thank the chairs for putting this together with the idea that I think we can do it. I want to be optimistic, but I think we're going to be pushing the rock up a very steep hill if we don't all work together.
Good. No, thank you so much. And, again, this session is really focused on some lessons learned. I think we've identified a number of the problems and a number of the challenges. I think we've had some ideas about really big system changes that could happen to help us get ready. We've had some really concrete examples, like work with community health workers and some of the kinds of changes that Olive and Africa CDC are trying to put in place that probably are more short-term achievable. And then we've got some really big global challenges, whether it is figuring out about our global infodemic issues or getting a medical countermeasure platform in place that can work in the future that we all need to continue to grapple with. But I want to thank our panelists for very stimulating comments and conversations. I know some people have been asking about where the slides can be found. This material will be available on the Academic Medical Education website in a few days, and I think you would be able to find it there. I've also been asked to remind you to please fill out your survey. And thank you again for joining this really interesting conversation. You're in for a real treat with our last session. And with that, I'll turn it back to the organizers. Thank you.